The mahogany desk creaked under the weight of scattered legal documents as I carefully photographed each page with my phone. Robert's study was bathed in the amber glow of his antique desk lamp, the same one he'd inherited from his grandfather, along with everything else that mattered in his world. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, documenting my own disinheritance in the very room where he'd planned it. My hands remained steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Years of medical training had taught me to maintain composure under pressure, though nothing in my surgical residency had prepared me for this particular operation. The will dated just 3 weeks ago lay open before me, its crisp legal language spelling out my husband's true intentions with surgical precision. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. To my beloved nephew Marcus Whitmore, I bequeath the entirety of my estate, including all real property, financial assets, and business interests. The words blurred as rage threatened to cloud my vision. Beloved nephew. The same Marcus who dropped out of 3 colleges, crashed 2 of Robert's cars, and whose idea of a career was managing his trust fund. Meanwhile, I, Dr. Elena Reyes Whitmore, who'd worked 18-hour shifts to put myself through medical school, who'd sacrificed my own surgical fellowship to support Robert's business ventures, was relegated to a single paragraph. To my wife, Elena, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my grandmother's jewelry collection, trusting this will provide adequate support for her transition to independent living. Adequate support. Transition to independent living. The condescension dripped from every carefully chosen word. After 12 years of marriage, after helping him build Whitmore Industries from a struggling family business into a multi-million-dollar empire, I was worth exactly $50,000 and some antique jewelry. I continued photographing, my surgeon's hands moving with methodical precision. Each page of the will revealed new insults: the Hamptons house going to Marcus, the art collection I'd helped curate donated to charity, even my own medical practice building, purchased with funds I'd helped generate, transferred to his nephews. Control. The sound of Robert's Mercedes pulling into the circular drive interrupted my documentation. I quickly returned the will to its exact position, my photographic memory serving me well after years of memorizing anatomical charts. The desk looked undisturbed, every paper in its precise place, every pen at the exact angle I'd found it. By the time Robert's key turned in the front door, I was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of his favorite butternut squash soup. The domestic scene was picture perfect, devoted wife preparing dinner for her successful husband. The same role I'd played for over a decade while secretly funding my own surgical practice and building a network Robert knew nothing about. Darling, Robert called out, his voice carrying that particular tone of satisfaction he used after successful business meetings. At 58, he still cut an impressive figure, silver hair perfectly styled, expensive suit tailored to hide the slight softness around his middle. To the outside world, we were the perfect power couple, the successful businessman and his brilliant doctor wife. In the kitchen, I replied, keeping my voice light and welcoming. The performance had to be flawless now. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Robert entered, already loosening his silk tie. He moved with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world, never questioned whether he deserved the empire his family had built over 3 generations. His kiss on my cheek was perfunctory, the kind of gesture that spoke of habit rather than affection. Excellent day, he announced, pouring himself a generous glass of the 30-year-old scotch I'd given him for his last birthday. The Patterson merger is finally moving forward. Marcus showed real promise in the negotiations. I kept stirring, my expression neutral. Marcus had shown promise. Of course he had. Robert had been grooming his nephew for succession for the past 2 years, ever since Marcus had finally managed to graduate with a business degree from his 4th university attempt. The boy, and at 26, he was still very much a boy, had never worked a day outside the family business, never faced real consequences for his failures. That's wonderful, I said, ladling soup into Robert's favorite bowl, Wedgwood china from his grandmother's collection, the same collection that would apparently be my consolation prize. How did he handle the financial projections? Robert's chest puffed with pride. Brilliantly. He's really coming into his own. I think he's ready for more responsibility. He paused, studying me with the calculating look I'd learned to recognize over the years. Actually, Elena, there's something we need to discuss. My hand stilled on the ladle. This was it, the conversation that would supposedly break the news of my reduced circumstances. I composed my features into an expression of mild curiosity, the same look I used when residents presented challenging cases. Oh? I turned to face him, bowl in hand. What's on your mind? Robert accepted the soup with a grunt of appreciation before settling into his usual chair at the kitchen island. The marble surface gleamed under the pendant lights I'd selected during our kitchen renovation 3 years ago. Every detail of this house bore my influence, from the custom cabinetry to the imported tile work. Soon, it would all belong to Marcus. It's about our future, darling, Robert began, his tone carefully measured. I've been thinking about succession planning, about what happens to the business when I'm no longer around. I took a seat across from him, my own bowl untouched. That's very responsible of you. Though I hope we don't need to worry about that for many years. Of course, he waved dismissively. But at my age, it's prudent to have everything in order. I've been working with the lawyers to update my will, to make sure everything is properly structured. The lawyers. Plural. I made a mental note to research which firm he'd been using. My own legal contacts might prove useful in the coming weeks. I see, I said carefully. And what have you decided? Robert's spoon clinked against the china as he consumed his soup with the methodical efficiency he applied to everything. Well, naturally, Marcus will inherit the business. He's family, he understands the industry, and he's been learning the ropes. It's the logical choice. Logical. As if logic had anything to do with handing a multi-million-dollar empire to someone whose greatest achievement was completing college on his 4th attempt. I nodded thoughtfully, playing the supportive wife considering her husband's wisdom. That makes sense, I agreed. Marcus has certainly been enthusiastic about learning the business. I paused delicately. What about the other assets? The houses? The investments? This was the moment Robert had been building toward. His expression shifted slightly, taking on what he probably thought was a compassionate look. Elena, darling, you have your medical practice. You're incredibly successful. In your own right. You don't need the burden of managing real estate and financial portfolios. The burden. My own success had become a weapon against me, justification for his betrayal. Because I'd built something of my own, I deserved nothing of what we'd built together. I suppose that's true, I said slowly, as if considering his reasoning for the first time. Though I had always assumed we'd face our later years together, sharing whatever we'd built. Robert reached across the marble surface to pat my hand with practiced affection. Of course we will, darling. Of course we will. But you know how complicated these family businesses can be. Better to keep things simple, keep the ownership clear. Marcus will take good care of everything. Marcus will take good care of everything. The same Marcus who'd crashed his Porsche into a fountain because he was texting while driving. The same Marcus who'd lost $50,000 at a casino in Monte Carlo and then asked Robert to cover his debts. This was the man who would control everything I'd helped build. What about the house? I asked with seemingly innocent curiosity. Our home? Something flickered in Robert's eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe just annoyance at having to explain what he considered obvious. Well, naturally, Marcus will need a suitable place to live when he takes over the business. This house has been in the family for 3 generations. It belongs with the business. I nodded slowly, as if digesting this revelation. I see. And where would I live? Elena, you're a successful surgeon. You can afford your own place. Something more suited to your needs. Maybe one of those modern condos downtown, near the hospital. He smiled as if offering me a wonderful gift. Think of it as a fresh start, a chance to create your own space. A fresh start. At 45, after 12 years of marriage, after helping him triple his family's wealth, I was being offered a fresh start like some kind of consolation prize. The audacity was breathtaking, even for Robert. That's quite a change, I said carefully. I've grown so attached to this house. All our memories are here. Robert's expression hardened slightly. This was the moment his patience for sentiment expired. revealing the calculating businessman underneath the caring husband facade. Elena, you need to be practical. This is about legacy, about family. The Whitmore family has owned this house for nearly a century. You're not a Whitmore, not really. Not really. There it was, the truth finally spoken aloud. After 12 years of using my name, my connections, my medical reputation to open doors for his business. After all the charity galas where I'd charmed potential clients and the social events where I'd represented the family, I wasn't really a Whitmore. I let the words hang in the air between us, watching his face for any sign of regret or recognition of what he'd just said. There was none. If anything, he looked relieved to have finally voiced what he'd apparently been thinking all along. I understand, I said quietly, my voice carrying just the right note of hurt resignation. I suppose you're right about the practical considerations. Robert relaxed visibly, probably thinking the difficult conversation was over. He'd presented his fait accompli, I'd accepted it with appropriate grace, and now he could return to his comfortable assumption that everyone would fall in line with his plans. I'm glad you see it that way, darling, he said, returning to his soup with renewed appetite. I was worried you might be emotional about it all. Emotional. Because wanting to share in what we'd built together was merely emotional, not rational. Because expecting some security after 12 years of marriage was sentiment, not sense. I filed the insult away with all the others, adding it to the growing evidence of how little he truly valued me. When do you plan to make these changes official? I asked, keeping my tone conversational. Well, the new will is already signed and notarized, Robert said casually, as if discussing weekend plans. And I've been talking to Marcus about timeline. For transition. Probably within the next year or two, depending on how quickly he picks things up. Already signed and notarized. The will I'd photographed wasn't a draft, it was the real thing, already legal and binding. Robert had moved with characteristic efficiency, securing his nephew's future while cutting me out entirely. The only thing that surprised me was his openness about it. Perhaps he thought I was too dependent, too passive to do anything but accept my fate gracefully. That seems very well planned, I said admiringly. You've clearly given this a lot of thought. I have indeed, Robert agreed, preening at what he took as praise for his foresight. It's taken months to get everything structured properly. The lawyers had to work through some complex tax implications, trust structures, that sort of thing. Months. He'd been planning this for months while I'd been playing the devoted wife, supporting his business decisions, entertaining his clients, sharing his bed. The betrayal was so complete, so thoroughly calculated, that I almost had to admire its cold efficiency. I stood to clear his empty bowl, my movements calm and domestic. More soup? No, thank you, darling. That was perfect. He checked his expensive watch, a Patek Philippe I'd given him for our 10th anniversary. I have some calls to make. That partnership in Singapore won't negotiate itself. As Robert headed toward his study, I began cleaning the kitchen with methodical precision. Each dish I washed, each surface I wiped, I thought about the conversation we'd just had. He'd revealed his hand completely, confident that I would accept my fate with the same quiet grace I'd shown throughout our marriage. What Robert didn't know was that grace and planning weren't mutually exclusive. He wasn't the only one who could play a long game. I dried my hands on the kitchen towel and retrieved my phone from the drawer where I'd hidden it during dinner. The photos of the will were crystal clear, every page perfectly documented. But pictures were just the beginning. What I needed now was information, about the lawyers, about the timing, about exactly how Robert had structured his betrayal. Moving quietly through the house, I could hear the low murmur of Robert's voice from behind his closed study door. The Singapore partnership, no doubt. Robert's voice carried that particular edge it took on during international negotiations, the tone that had intimidated countless business rivals over the years. But I wasn't a business rival. I was something much more dangerous, a wife who'd been underestimated for far too long. In our bedroom, I opened my laptop and began making notes. The first step was understanding exactly what I was up against. The will was comprehensive, but wills could be challenged. Estate law was complex, full of potential pitfalls for those who tried to cut out spouses entirely. Robert might have been thorough, but thoroughness and intelligence weren't the same thing. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant at the medical practice, Dr. Reyes. The Patterson consultation is confirmed for tomorrow at 2 p.m. Also, your accountant called about the quarterly review. I smiled, thinking about that quarterly review. Robert had no idea how successful my medical practice had become, how many influential connections I'd cultivated in the medical community, how much money I'd been quietly setting aside in accounts he knew nothing about. He saw my work as a hobby, a charming accessory to his own success. That misconception was about to become very expensive for him. I pulled up my secure banking app, reviewing the accounts I'd been building for the past 5 years. What had started as a precaution, a small fund for emergencies, had grown into something substantial. Money from my surgical practice, speaking fees from medical conferences, consulting work with pharmaceutical companies. All of it carefully documented, all of it legitimately earned, all of it completely separate from Robert's knowledge or control. Robert thought he was cutting me out with $50,000 and some jewelry. What he didn't realize was that I'd already accumulated nearly 3 times his liquid assets in accounts he'd never seen. The difference was that my money came from saving lives, not manipulating them, but this wasn't about money, not really. This was about respect, about recognition, about ensuring that Robert's arrogance came with appropriate consequences. He'd spent months planning my exile from his life while I'd been playing the perfect wife. Now it was time to see how he handled being outmaneuvered by someone he dismissed as merely emotional. I opened a new document on my laptop and began typing project. Documentation, Phase 1, Discovery Date, today's date. Status, Robert's intentions confirmed and documented. Next steps, legal consultation, asset protection, timeline development. This wasn't revenge. Revenge was emotional, impulsive, destructive. This was surgery, precise, calculated, and designed to remove the diseased tissue while preserving everything healthy around it. Robert's voice echoed down the hallway as his call ended. Soon he'd be coming to bed, probably feeling satisfied with his productive day. He'd negotiated a successful merger, planned his nephew's future, and informed his wife of her diminished prospects. In his mind, everything was proceeding perfectly according to plan. What he didn't know was that the plan had just changed. The patient had awakened on the operating table, and the surgeon was about to take control of the procedure. I closed the laptop and prepared for bed, my mind already working through the next steps. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new information, new opportunities. But tonight, I would lie beside my husband and let him think he'd won. After all, the most successful operations began with the patient believing everything was perfectly normal, right up until the moment the real work began. The law offices of Morrison, Fletcher and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming downtown high-rise, their marble lobby designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. I sat in the reception area, outwardly the picture of a grieving wife seeking legal counsel, while internally cataloging every detail of the environment where Robert's betrayal had been legally sanctified. Dr. Marcus Whitmore, a young paralegal, approached with nervous deference. Mr. Fletcher will see you now. I followed her through corridors lined with portraits of distinguished partners, their painted eyes seeming to judge the steady stream of clients seeking justice, revenge, or simply a way out of impossible situations. How many wives had walked these halls before me, discovering too late that love and law operated by entirely different rules? David Fletcher rose from behind an enormous desk as I entered his corner office. At 62, he commanded the kind of respect that came from 40 years of high-stakes litigation and an unbroken string of victories against supposedly impossible odds. His reputation for discretion was legendary, exactly what I needed for what I was planning. "Doctor, please, have a seat," Fletcher said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to delivering both good news and devastating verdicts. "I understand you have some concerns about estate planning?" I settled into the leather chair across from his desk, my posture conveying just the right mixture of vulnerability and determination. "It's my husband, Mr. Fletcher. I've discovered some troubling information about his recent will changes." Fletcher's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested keen interest. "What kind of troubling information?" I reached into my purse and withdrew a tablet. The images of Robert's will already loaded and ready for review. 3 weeks ago, my husband had his will revised. I wasn't consulted, and the provisions are quite different from what we'd discussed previously. As Fletcher scrolled through the photographs, his poker face cracked slightly. In my years as a surgeon, I'd learned to read micro-expressions, the tiny tells that revealed what people were really thinking. What I saw on Fletcher's face was professional shock mixed with something that looked suspiciously like admiration for the thoroughness of Robert's planning. "These are very clear images," Fletcher said carefully. "May I ask how you obtained them?" "I found the will in my husband's study. I thought I should document it before seeking legal advice." I paused delicately. I wasn't sure if photographing it was appropriate, but I was concerned about my options. Fletcher set down the tablet and leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in the classic pose of a lawyer considering complex angles. "Dr. Reyes Whitmore, I have to ask, are you currently considering divorce proceedings?" "No," I replied quickly, letting a note of hurt surprise color my voice. "Robert is my husband. I love him. But I'm also not naive about what this will mean for my future security." This was the crucial moment. Fletcher needed to see me as a concerned wife seeking protection, not a vengeful spouse planning warfare. The distinction would determine how much help he'd be willing to provide. "I see," Fletcher said slowly. "Well, I can tell you that these provisions are unusual for a marriage of your length and circumstances. Typically, spouses receive a more substantial portion of the estate, especially when they've contributed to its growth." "That's what concerns me," I said, allowing a slight tremor to enter my voice. "I've supported Robert's business for 12 years. I've used my medical connections to help him secure contracts, hosted clients in our home, even provided medical consultation for some of his overseas projects. And yet you're receiving what amounts to a token settlement," Fletcher finished. "Yes, I can see why you'd be concerned." Fletcher pulled out a legal pad and began making notes, his pen moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd analyzed thousands of similar situations. "Tell me about your marriage. Any prenuptial agreements? Previous wills? Changes in your relationship dynamics?" For the next hour, I painted a careful picture of my marriage to Robert. I described his growing closeness to Marcus, his increasing dismissiveness of my contributions, his gradual shift from partnership to paternalism. I was careful to present facts without emotional interpretation, letting Fletcher draw his own conclusions about the pattern of behavior. "Has your husband discussed these changes with you directly?" Fletcher asked. "Yes, just last night." I recounted the conversation in detail, watching Fletcher's expression grow more grim with each revelation. Robert's casual dismissal of my contributions, his assumption that I would simply accept my reduced circumstances, his explicit statement that I wasn't really a Whitmore, all of it painted a picture of a man who saw his wife as disposable. Fletcher set down his pen and looked at me directly. "Dr. Reyes Whitmore, I'm going to be frank with you. This will is vulnerable to challenge, but any such challenge would be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially destructive to your marriage. What are my alternatives?" "Well," Fletcher leaned forward, his voice taking on the conspiratorial tone of someone sharing privileged information, "there are several approaches we could consider. Asset protection strategies, for instance. If you're concerned about future security, there are ways to safeguard your own resources independently." This was exactly what I'd hoped to hear. "What kind of strategies?" "First, we'd need to conduct a comprehensive audit of your personal assets. Your medical practice, any separate investments, property held in your name alone, all of that could be structured to ensure maximum protection regardless of what happens with your husband's estate." I nodded thoughtfully. "I do have my practice, and some investments I've made independently." "Excellent. We'd also want to examine the timing of your husband's will changes. If there's evidence of undue influence from the nephew, or if there are any procedural irregularities in how the will was executed, those could provide grounds for challenge." Fletcher pulled up a calendar on his computer. "I'd like to schedule you for a comprehensive consultation next week. Bring all your financial documents, any correspondence about the will changes, and anything else that might be relevant. We'll need to move carefully, but there are definitely options to explore." As I left Fletcher's office, my mind was already working through the implications of our conversation. The legal approach was just one avenue, but it was an important foundation for everything else I was planning. If Robert wanted to play games with wills and inheritance, he needed to understand that I was far better at strategy than he'd ever imagined. My next stop was across town, in a converted warehouse that housed the offices of Sullivan Investigations. Unlike Fletcher's intimidating marble and mahogany, Sullivan's office was all exposed brick and industrial fixtures, the aesthetic of professionals who did their best work in shadows. Margaret Sullivan had built her reputation investigating corporate fraud and marital infidelity, often for clients who needed information that couldn't be obtained through traditional legal channels. Her discretion was absolute, her methods were unquestionable, and her results were legendary. She was exactly what I needed for the next phase of my investigation. Dr. Marcus Whitmore, Sullivan stood as I entered her office, her handshake firm and her gaze direct. At 55, she moved with the controlled energy of someone who'd spent decades reading people's secrets in their body language, their credit reports, and their deleted emails. I understand you have a delicate situation that requires some research. I settled into the chair across from her cluttered desk, noting the wall of monitors displaying what looked like various surveillance feeds and data streams. My husband has recently made some significant changes to his estate planning. I'd like to understand the full scope of those changes and the influences behind them. Sullivan's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slight nod of someone who'd heard similar requests countless times before. When you say influences, are you referring to the nephew mentioned in your initial contact? Marcus Whitmore, yes. But I suspect there may be other factors involved. Financial pressures, business relationships, personal dynamics I'm not aware of. I paused carefully. I want to understand what I'm really dealing with before I make any decisions about my future. Understood. Sullivan pulled out a digital tablet and began typing. I'll need some basic information to get started. Full names, addresses, business associations, known financial institutions. The more detail you can provide, the more comprehensive the investigation can be. For the next 30 minutes, I provided Sullivan with everything I knew about Robert's business relationships, Marcus's background, and the timeline of recent changes in our household dynamics. She asked pointed questions about Robert's travel patterns, his business associates, and any unusual financial activities I might have noticed. One thing I'm curious about, Sullivan said, reviewing her notes, is the timing of these will changes. Was there any particular trigger event? A business crisis, health scare, family conflict? I thought back over the past few months, trying to identify any watershed moments. There was a health scare about 6 months ago. Robert had some chest pains that turned out to be stress-related, but it required hospitalization. Marcus was very attentive during that period. Sullivan made a note. And how did your husband's attitude toward you change after that incident? Gradually at first, then more noticeably. He started including Marcus in more business decisions, spending more time with him privately. There were several weekend trips to the family cabin that I wasn't invited to. I paused, remembering how hurt I'd been at the time. I assumed it was just Robert wanting to mentor his nephew. I thought it was actually quite sweet. Family dynamics often shift during health crises, Sullivan observed. People start thinking about mortality, legacy, succession. Sometimes those thoughts are influenced by people who have their own agendas. The implication was clear, and it aligned with my own growing suspicions. Marcus had swooped in during Robert's moment of vulnerability, positioning himself as the devoted nephew while subtly undermining my role as wife and partner. It was actually quite brilliant, in its way. How long will your investigation take? I asked. Initial findings within a week, comprehensive report within 2 to 3 weeks. I'll be looking at financial records, communications, travel patterns, and relationship networks. If there are any irregularities or external influences, I'll find them. As I left Sullivan's office, I felt the first genuine surge of optimism I'd experienced since discovering Robert's betrayal. Information was power, and soon I would have more information about my husband's motivations than he probably had himself. But information was just the foundation. What I needed next was protection for my own assets and interests. That required a different kind of expertise. The offices of Hartwell Asset Management occupied a discreet suite in an exclusive financial district building, the kind of place where old money went to stay old and new money went to learn discretion. I'd been referred to Jennifer Hartwell by one of my surgical colleagues whose own divorce had required complex financial maneuvering. Hartwell was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, but her reputation for protecting high net worth individuals during family crises was already legendary. She specialized in what she called defensive financial planning, strategies for people who needed to protect their assets from spouses, business partners, or other potential threats. Dr. Reyes, Hartwell said as we settled into her private conference room, I understand you're concerned about asset protection in the context of potential marital difficulties. That's correct, I replied. My husband has made some concerning changes to his estate planning without consulting me. I want to ensure my own financial security regardless of what happens in our marriage. Hartwell nodded approvingly. Prudent. Prevention is always more effective than remediation. Tell me about your current financial situation, both joint assets, and anything you hold independently. I spent the next hour providing a comprehensive overview of my finances. My medical practice, which generated substantial income through both surgery and consulting work. My investment portfolio, built carefully over years of saving and strategic planning. The real estate I'd purchased independently, including a small office building that housed several medical practices. Hartwell's eyes widened slightly as I detailed the scope of my independent wealth. Doctor, you're in a much stronger position than most spouses facing similar situations. Your income stream is entirely independent, and your asset base is substantial. That gives us significant flexibility in terms of protective strategies. What kind of strategies? Several options. We could establish a series of domestic asset protection trusts, restructure your business holdings for maximum privacy, and create additional layers of legal separation between your wealth and any potential claims from your husband's estate. Hartwell pulled up a complex flowchart on her computer. The key is creating legal distance while maintaining your access and control. As Hartwell outlined the various approaches, I began to see how thoroughly I could insulate myself from Robert's financial decisions. Not only could I protect what I'd already built, but I could position myself to actually benefit from his attempts to cut me out of his will. There's one more element to consider, Hartwell said as our meeting drew to a close. If your husband is making these changes without fully understanding your independent financial position, he may be significantly underestimating your ability to respond. That miscalculation could work very much in your favor. I smiled, thinking about Robert's assumption that $50,000 would constitute adequate support for my transition to independence. He had no idea that I could probably buy out his nephew's inheritance without touching my principal assets. How quickly can we implement these protections? I asked. Basic structures within a week, comprehensive implementation within a month. The sooner we start, the more options we'll have available. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the productive day of reconnaissance and preparation. In just 8 hours, I'd assembled a legal team, initiated a comprehensive investigation, and begun implementing financial protections that would ensure my security regardless of Robert's plans. But most importantly, I'd confirmed what I'd suspected. From the moment I found that will, Robert had made a catastrophic error in judgment. He'd assumed I was vulnerable, dependent, and passive. In reality, I was financially independent, professionally connected, and strategically minded. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to gather information and strengthen my position. Robert thought he was playing chess against an amateur, but he was about to discover that his opponent had been studying the game much longer than he'd realized. The house was dark when I arrived home, Robert's car absent from the driveway. Probably another late dinner with potential clients, or perhaps another planning session with his beloved nephew. Either way, his absence gave me time to review my notes from the day and plan my next moves. In my study, the small room Robert had dismissively called my hobby office, I opened my laptop and began updating my project documentation. Each meeting, each revelation, each new protective measure was carefully recorded. By the time Robert realized what was happening, I would have a complete record of every step in my defensive strategy. As I worked, my phone buzzed with a text from Robert, late meeting with Singapore investors. Don't wait up. I smiled, typing back a reply, of course, darling. Sleep well when you get home. Let him think I was the same passive wife he'd always known. Let him believe his secret planning was proceeding undetected. Soon enough, he would learn the difference between strategy and arrogance, between planning and wishful thinking. The game had begun, and I was already several moves ahead. The preliminary report from Sullivan Investigations arrived via encrypted Email at precisely 6:47 a.m., while Robert was still sleeping off another late night of business meetings. I read it in my car outside the hospital, the morning sun casting long shadows across the parking garage as I absorbed information that exceeded even my darkest suspicions. Marcus hadn't just influenced Robert's will changes, he'd orchestrated them with surgical precision. The report detailed a web of manipulation that stretched back 18 months, beginning with Marcus's sudden interest in family history and business legacy. Phone records showed daily conversations between nephew and uncle, often lasting hours. Credit card statements revealed expensive dinners at Robert's favorite restaurants, weekend trips to exclusive resorts, and carefully timed gifts that coincided with major business decisions. But the most damaging revelation was a series of recorded conversations Sullivan had obtained through sources I preferred not to examine too closely. Marcus discussing strategy with someone named Caroline Winters, a woman who appeared to be both his girlfriend and a sophisticated con artist with a history of targeting wealthy older men through their family members. I scrolled through the transcript, my surgeon's training helping me maintain steady hands despite the rage building in my chest. Marcus, the old man's completely bought into the family legacy angle. Keeps talking about how Elena doesn't understand the business, how she's an outsider. Caroline, perfect. Has he mentioned changing the will yet? Marcus, he's thinking about it. I've been dropping hints about simplified inheritance, keeping everything in the bloodline. Caroline, you're brilliant, this is working exactly like you said it would. Caroline, just remember, once you inherit, we need to liquidate quickly. The business is worth more in pieces than as a whole. Find the right buyers, break it up, take the cash and run. Liquidate. Break it up. They weren't planning to preserve Robert's legacy, they were planning to destroy it for quick cash. The family business that had survived 3 generations, the company Robert cherished above all else, was slated for dismemberment by the nephew he trusted most. I forwarded the report to my secure cloud storage and deleted it from my phone. The information was explosive, but timing would be everything. Robert needed to discover Marcus's true intentions at precisely the right moment, when the revelation would cause maximum impact and create opportunities for my own strategic moves. My phone buzzed with a text from Robert. Marcus is joining us for dinner tonight. Thought you should know. How considerate of him to give me advance notice of my replacement's presence at what was still technically my dinner table. I typed back, wonderful. I'll make his favorite lamb. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was about to prepare a feast for the man plotting to steal everything while his unwitting victim looked on with paternal pride. But dinner would provide the perfect opportunity to observe their dynamics and plant some seeds of my OWN. The hospital, I moved through my morning surgeries with mechanical precision, my hands saving lives while my mind calculated angles of attack. Between procedures, I made strategic calls to colleagues, quietly building the network I would need for the next phase of my plan. Dr. Patricia Hendricks answered on the second ring. Elena. How are you, dear? I haven't seen you since the medical convention. Patricia was the chief of staff at Metropolitan General and one of the most connected women in the city's medical community. More importantly, she sat on the board of the Children's Hospital Foundation, the same foundation that was set to receive a significant charitable donation in Robert's will. Patricia, I'm wonderful, thank you. Listen, I'm calling about the foundation board meeting next week. I'd like to attend as an observer, if possible. Of course. We'd be delighted to have you. Are you thinking about joining the board? We could certainly use your expertise. Perhaps. I'm exploring some significant charitable giving opportunities, and want to understand how the foundation operates. I paused carefully. My husband has been discussing some major donations, and I want to make sure we're partnering with organizations that share our values. That's wonderful news. Your husband's business acumen would be invaluable to our fundraising efforts. If she only knew that Robert's business acumen had led him to trust a nephew planning to liquidate everything for quick cash. But that revelation would come at the appropriate time. My next call was to Dr. Michael Torres, a forensic accountant who specialized in fraud detection for medical practices. We'd worked together when one of my colleagues had suspected embezzlement in his practice. Elena, Michael's voice carried the warmth of professional respect. What can I do for you? Michael, I need a favor. I'd like you to conduct a comprehensive audit of my husband's business, Whitmore Industries. completely confidential, billed to my practice. May I ask what you're looking for? Irregularities. Particularly anything involving family members or recently hired employees. I have reason to believe there may be some creative accounting happening. Michael's tone sharpened with interest. When do you need this completed? Within 2 weeks. If possible. And Michael? I need this to be bulletproof. If there's fraud happening, I want documentation that would stand up in court. By the time I left the hospital that afternoon, I had assembled the pieces for a comprehensive investigation. That would extend far beyond what Sullivan's team could provide. If Marcus and his girlfriend were planning to loot Robert's business, they would have left financial footprints. And when those footprints were discovered, the timing would be entirely of my choosing. I arrived home to find Robert already entertaining Marcus in the living room, the two of them bent over what appeared to be architectural plans spread across the coffee table. Marcus looked up as I entered, his boyish smile carrying none of the calculation I now knew lay beneath it. Aunt Elena. He stood to embrace me with practiced warmth. Uncle Robert was just showing me the renovation plans for the cabin. Aunt Elena. The affectionate title that had once made me feel included in the family now sounded like mockery. I returned his embrace with equal warmth, playing my role perfectly. How exciting, I said, examining the plans with apparent interest. Are you planning major changes? Just some updates, Robert replied proudly. Marcus had some excellent suggestions about modernizing the kitchen and adding a proper home office. He'll be spending a lot more time there once he takes on more responsibility. Of course he would. The family cabin that had been in the Whitmore family for 50 years was apparently being renovated for Marcus's comfort. I wondered if Robert realized he was funding improvements to property that his nephew planned to sell the moment the inheritance cleared. That sounds wonderful, I said admiringly. Marcus, you have such good instincts about these things. Marcus preened at the praise, his ego requiring constant feeding. I just think about functionality, you know? The cabin should serve the family's needs for generations to come. Generations to come. The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease. I excused myself to prepare dinner, leaving them to their planning while I contemplated the evening's strategy. The lamb was perfect, tender, aromatic, paired with Marcus's favorite wine and served on the good china that would apparently become his property in the near future. Throughout dinner, I played the gracious hostess while quietly studying the interplay between Robert and his nephew. Marcus had clearly spent considerable time perfecting his approach. He asked thoughtful questions about business strategy, offered intelligent observations about market conditions, and displayed just the right amount of deference to Robert's experience. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and I found myself grudgingly impressed by his skill. Uncle Robert, Marcus said as we finished the main course, I've been thinking about what you said regarding estate planning. Have you given any more thought to the timing? Robert glanced at me briefly before responding. Actually, yes. I've already made most of the necessary changes. Everything should be properly structured within the next few months. That's very responsible, Marcus agreed. I know Elena supports your decision to keep things simple and clear. He was testing me, trying to gauge whether Robert had told me about the will changes. I met his gaze directly, my expression serene and supportive. Of course I do, I said warmly. Robert's judgment about family matters has always been excellent. I trust his decisions completely. Marcus relaxed visibly, apparently satisfied that I remained ignorant of my reduced circumstances. Robert looked pleased with what he interpreted as my wifely submission to his superior wisdom. Actually, I continued casually, speaking of family decisions, I had an interesting conversation today with Patricia Hendricks from the Children's Hospital Foundation. She mentioned they're always looking for board members with business expertise. Robert's eyes lit up with interest. The Children's Hospital? That's a prestigious organization. Very prestigious, I agreed. And they're particularly interested in significant donors who might want to take active roles in governance. I paused delicately. Patricia mentioned that major donors often find board service very fulfilling, especially when they're thinking about their legacies. I watched both men process this information, seeing different calculations behind their eyes. Robert was thinking about social prestige and civic responsibility. Marcus was probably thinking about how charitable donations would reduce the size of his inheritance. That's definitely worth considering, Robert said thoughtfully. What kind of commitment are they looking for? Oh, not too demanding. Monthly meetings, annual fundraising events, strategic planning sessions. The kind of involvement that really allows donors to see their impact. I smiled sweetly. Patricia said they're especially appreciative when major donors attend the annual audit presentations. Transparency is so important in charitable giving. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. If he was skimming money from Robert's business to fund his lifestyle with Caroline, the last thing he'd want was his uncle developing an interest in financial transparency and audit procedures. Sounds time-consuming, Marcus said carefully. Uncle Robert already has so many commitments. True, Robert replied, but I could see the idea had taken root. Though it might be good to get more involved with charitable work. Especially if we're planning significant donations anyway. The seed was planted. Robert was now thinking about charitable involvement, which would naturally lead to questions about financial oversight and transparency. When Michael Torres's audit revealed Marcus's irregularities, Robert would already be primed to understand the implications. After Marcus left, claiming an early morning meeting, Robert and I cleaned up together in companionable silence. The domestic routine felt surreal given what I now knew about our future, but I maintained the facade perfectly. Marcus seems to be maturing, I observed as I loaded the dishwasher. He's taking such an interest in family history and business legacy. He really is, Robert agreed proudly. I think losing his father so young made him appreciate the importance of family connections. He's genuinely committed to preserving what we've built. Preserving what we've built. If Robert only knew that Marcus was actively planning its destruction, that every conversation about legacy was actually reconnaissance for liquidation. But he would know soon enough. It's wonderful that he has such clear priorities, I said carefully. Though I sometimes worry about young people today. They seem so focused on quick results, immediate gratification. Not like your generation, which understood the value of patience and long-term thinking. Robert nodded approvingly. Exactly. That's why I'm confident about Marcus. He understands that real wealth isn't about fast money, it's about building something that lasts. I finished loading the dishwasher, biting back the urge to tell Robert exactly what his nephew understood about fast money and building things that lasted. Instead, I kissed his cheek and headed upstairs, leaving him to his satisfied delusions. In my study, I reviewed the day's progress with quiet satisfaction. The audit was in motion, the charitable foundation connection was established. And Marcus had revealed more of his hand than he probably realized. Most importantly, Robert was beginning to think about transparency and oversight at exactly the moment when such thinking would become most dangerous for his nephew. My phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer Hartwell, asset protection structures in place. Your independent holdings are now completely shielded from any potential claims or complications. Perfect. Whatever happened next, my own financial security was bulletproof. Robert could cut me out of his will, Marcus could inherit everything. And Caroline could liquidate the entire business. None of it would touch my independently built wealth, but I wasn't planning to simply protect myself. I was planning to win. The next phase would require perfect timing and flawless execution. Marcus thought he was weeks away from inheriting everything, but he was actually days away from losing everything. Robert thought he was securing his legacy, but he was about to discover how thoroughly his trust had been betrayed, and I was about to transform from the overlooked wife into the architect of justice. The game was accelerating, and every piece was moving exactly where I needed it to be. Soon, Robert would have to choose between his nephew's lies and the truth I was about to reveal. When that moment came, I intended to be holding all the cards. After Robert left, I implemented the final phases of my preparation. First, a call to my surgical assistant to clear my afternoon schedule. Then a message to Sullivan's team to intensify their surveillance of Marcus and Caroline. Finally, a careful review of the recordings I'd made of all previous conversations with Robert about the will, Marcus, and his business plans. At 9:30 a.m., while Robert was parking outside the coffee shop where he would spend an hour being manipulated by his nephew, I was walking into Michael Torres's office to collect the evidence that would change everything. This is the preliminary version, Michael said, handing me a slim folder. Financial irregularities only, no mention of the broader conspiracy. And this, he handed me a thick envelope, is everything. The full scope of what they've been doing. I tucked both packages into my briefcase with the care of a surgeon handling delicate instruments. Michael, one more favor. I need you to prepare a presentation version of the preliminary findings. Something that could be shown to board members or business partners if questions arise about financial stability. You want me to package this as a standard audit finding? Exactly. Nothing inflammatory, nothing that suggests deliberate investigation. Just the kind of routine financial review that any responsible business owner might commission. By 11 a.m., I had positioned myself in the coffee shop across the street from where Robert and Marcus were meeting. Through the window, I could see them at their usual table, Marcus gesturing enthusiastically while Robert nodded with paternal approval. Neither of them had any idea they were being observed by the wife and aunt they'd so thoroughly underestimated. My phone rang right on schedule. Dr. Reyes? This is Patricia Hendricks. I received your email last night, and I'm quite concerned about what you mentioned. Could we meet today to discuss these financial irregularities? Of course, Patricia. I think it would be wise to address these concerns before they become more serious. Would 2 p.m. work? I'd like to bring our financial committee chair as well. Given the size of the donations under discussion, we need to ensure proper due diligence. Perfect. I'll bring documentation to support our conversation. Across the street, Marcus and Robert were standing to leave, their meeting concluded with what appeared to be mutual satisfaction. Robert looked pleased with whatever timeline they'd established for the transition. Marcus looked like a young man who believed he was weeks away from inheriting millions. Neither of them realized that by evening, everything would be different. I drove home to prepare for the afternoon's performance. In a few hours, I would sit across from Patricia Hendricks and her committee chair, expressing concerned confusion about financial irregularities that threatened Robert's ability to make charitable donations. Their questions about his business stability would seem natural and appropriate. When Patricia called Robert to discuss the foundation's concerns, he would be forced to investigate the very irregularities that Marcus had been working so hard to conceal. And when that investigation revealed the full scope of the betrayal, I would be perfectly positioned as the loyal wife who had tried to protect both Robert and the foundation from scandal. The trap was set. All that remained was waiting for Marcus to walk into it.as I changed into the conservative business suit I'd selected for the foundation meeting. I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The woman looking back bore little resemblance to the passive wife Robert thought he'd dismissed with $50,000 and some jewelry. This was Dr. Elena Reyes Whitmore, surgeon and strategist, the woman who was about to perform the most precise operation of her career. The patient was about to wake up, and the real surgery was about to begin. The foundation boardroom overlooked the city's financial district, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the corporate towers where fortunes were made and lost with equal frequency. Patricia Hendricks sat across from me at the polished conference table, flanked by Douglas Chen, the foundation's financial committee chair, and Rebecca Walsh, their chief compliance officer. Dr. Reyes Whitmore, Patricia began, her tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone navigating potentially dangerous waters. Your email raised some concerning questions about your husband's business. Can you elaborate on these financial irregularities you mentioned? I opened my briefcase with deliberate precision, withdrawing Michael's preliminary report. I commissioned a routine financial review of our joint assets for estate planning purposes. The accountant found some unexpected patterns that I think you should be aware of before considering any major donation commitments. Douglas Chen accepted the report, his experienced eyes scanning the executive summary with the sharp focus of someone who'd spent decades evaluating financial risks. These numbers show systematic fund diversions over an 18-month period. That's not a paperwork error, that's deliberate. Exactly, I replied, allowing genuine concern to color my voice. The amounts aren't enormous in themselves, but the pattern suggests someone with inside access is systematically removing money from company accounts. Rebecca Walsh leaned forward, her compliance background evident in her immediate focus on the operational implications. Dr. Reyes Whitmore, does your husband know about this investigation? Not yet. I wanted to understand the scope before involving him. I paused carefully. Robert's been under considerable stress lately, working closely with his nephew on succession planning. I didn't want to add to his burden unless it was absolutely necessary. The three foundation leaders exchanged meaningful glances. They were connecting dots I hadn't explicitly drawn: a stressed business owner, family succession planning, and mysterious financial irregularities. The implications were obvious to anyone with experience in institutional philanthropy. Given these findings, Patricia said slowly, I think we need to postpone any formal discussions about major donations until these issues are resolved. I understand completely, I replied. I actually think it would be appropriate for you to reach out to Robert directly. As potential partners in significant charitable work, you have every right to express concerns about financial stability. Douglas nodded approvingly. Standard due diligence. We'd be negligent not to address potential red flags before accepting substantial gifts. Perfect. When Patricia called Robert, her concerns would seem like routine institutional caution rather than the result of my investigation. Robert would be forced to examine his own business with fresh eyes, guided by questions from respected community leaders who had no apparent agenda beyond protecting their foundation. There's one more thing, I added as the meeting concluded. If these irregularities prove to be more serious than they appear, the foundation should know that I've taken steps to protect my personal assets independently. Whatever happens with Robert's business, my own charitable giving capacity remains secure. This was crucial positioning. I needed them to see me as a potential major donor in my own right, someone worth cultivating regardless of what happened to Robert's wealth. When the dust settled, I wanted the foundation to view me as a solution rather than a casualty. As I left the foundation offices, my phone buzzed with a text from Sullivan's surveillance team. Target subjects meeting at Seasons Hotel, room 1247. Full recording equipment in place. The timing was perfect. While I was establishing external pressure through the foundation, Marcus and Caroline were undoubtedly discussing their final preparations for looting Robert's business. Every word they spoke was being recorded, adding to the mountain of evidence that would destroy them. I drove to my medical practice, using the familiar routine of patient consultations to maintain my emotional equilibrium while waiting for the trap to spring. Between appointments, I monitored updates from my various intelligence sources. At 3:47 p.m., Patricia's call to Robert went exactly as anticipated. My surveillance equipment picked up his side of the conversation from his office. Patricia, how wonderful to hear from you. What concerns? Financial irregularities? I'm sure there's some explanation. Yes, of course I'll look into it immediately. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. The confusion in Robert's voice was genuine. Until this moment, he'd had complete faith in his business operations and the people managing them. Patricia's professional concerns were the first crack in his confidence, the beginning of the doubt that would eventually consume his trust in Marcus. At 4:15 p.m., my phone rang. Robert's voice carried a tension I hadn't heard in years. Elena, I just had the strangest call from Patricia Hendricks at the Children's Hospital Foundation. She mentioned some financial concerns about the business. Do you know anything about this? Oh, Robert, I said with carefully calibrated surprise. I may have inadvertently caused this. I commissioned a financial review for our estate planning, and the accountant found some small irregularities. I mentioned it to Patricia because I was worried about how it might affect our charitable giving plans. What kind of irregularities? Nothing dramatic, just some money transfers that didn't seem to follow normal patterns. The accountant said it was probably just accounting errors, but I thought we should be transparent with any organizations we're planning to work with. After all, the most successful surgeries weren't just about cutting out diseased tissue, they were about ensuring the patient emerged stronger and healthier than before. Operation Marcus was about to begin in earnest. Dr. Michael Torres called me at 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday, his voice carrying the electric tension of someone who'd uncovered something explosive. I was in my study, supposedly reading medical journals while actually monitoring the electronic surveillance I'd had installed in Robert's office earlier that week. Elena, Michael's voice was barely above a whisper, you need to see this. Tonight. Can you meet me at my office? The urgency in his tone sent adrenaline coursing through my system. What did you find? Not over the phone. This is bigger than embezzlement. This is systematic fraud, and it goes back further than you think. I glanced at the monitor, showing Robert's empty office, then at our bedroom where he was sleeping soundly after another evening of strategic planning with Marcus. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Michael's office building was nearly deserted at midnight, its corridors echoing with the hollow sound of my heels against marble floors. I found him in his conference room, surrounded by printouts, computer screens, and the kind of organized chaos that accompanied major financial discoveries. "Show me," I said without preamble. Michael gestured to a wall-mounted screen displaying a complex flow chart of financial transactions. "Marcus has been skimming for 18 months, but it's sophisticated. Small amounts from multiple accounts, transferred through shell companies, then laundered through investment vehicles before ending up in accounts controlled by Caroline Winters." I studied the diagram, my medical training helping me follow the pathways of financial infection through Robert's business. "How much so far?" "Just over $2 million. But Elena, that's not the worst part." Michael clicked to another screen. "Look at this." The new display showed Marcus's access logs to Robert's financial systems. The timestamps revealed a pattern of after-hours activity, systematic downloading of client information, and unauthorized access to confidential business data. "He's been copying everything," Michael continued. "Client lists, financial records, strategic plans, vendor contracts. Everything needed to either blackmail your husband or recreate the business elsewhere." The scope of Marcus's betrayal was breathtaking. He wasn't just stealing money, he was stealing the entire business model, preparing to either destroy Robert through exposure or compete with him using stolen intelligence. "There's more," Michael said grimly. "These records show that Caroline Winters has done this before. 3 times, in fact. Each time with a different wealthy family, each time using a romantic relationship with a family member to gain access." He pulled up a dossier that Sullivan's team had compiled on Caroline. 3 previous aliases, 3 previous wealthy victims. All of them older men who'd trusted nephews or sons who'd fallen under her influence. In each case, the pattern was identical: manipulation, theft, liquidation, and disappearance. "What happened to the previous victims?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Bankruptcy in 2 cases, suicide in the 3rd. She's very good at what she does." I stared at the evidence, feeling the weight of what Robert didn't know. His beloved nephew wasn't just planning to inherit his empire, he was actively destroying it while building the tools for his own competing business. And when Marcus had extracted everything of value, he and Caroline would disappear, leaving Robert with nothing but the realization of how completely he'd been played. "Michael, I need you to prepare 2 versions of this report. One comprehensive version with everything you've found, and one preliminary version that focuses just on the financial irregularities without mentioning the broader scheme." Michael nodded, understanding immediately. "When do you need them?" "Tomorrow." "And Michael? This needs to be bulletproof. If we're going to bring down a sophisticated operation like this, the evidence has to be unassailable." As I drove home through empty streets, my mind raced through the implications of what I'd learned. Marcus wasn't just a greedy nephew, he was part of a professional con operation. Caroline had turned him into a weapon against his own family, and Robert was walking blindly toward financial and emotional destruction, but knowledge was power, and I now held all the cards. The question was how to play them for maximum effect. I slipped back into the house silently, checking the surveillance monitors to ensure nothing had been disturbed. Robert was still sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the fact that his wife had just uncovered evidence that could save or destroy him, depending on how she chose to use it. In my study, I opened my laptop and began composing a careful email to Patricia Hendricks at the Children's Hospital Foundation. If I was going to bring down Marcus and Caroline, I needed Robert to discover their betrayal in a context that would make him receptive to my guidance rather than defensive about his judgment. Subject: Board position discussion. Confidential. Patricia, thank you again for your interest in Robert's potential board service. Before we proceed, I wanted to discuss some concerns that have come to my attention regarding our family's charitable giving capacity. I've recently learned that Robert's business may be experiencing some financial irregularities that could affect his ability to make the donations we discussed. Would it be possible to schedule a private meeting to discuss how the foundation typically handles due diligence on major donors? I'm particularly interested in understanding your audit procedures and how you verify the legitimacy of large gifts. As a medical professional, I believe strongly in transparency and want to ensure any donations we make are properly structured. Would you have time to meet this week? I think it would be beneficial to discuss these matters before Robert becomes too committed to any specific giving plans. Best regards, Elena. The email was perfectly crafted to plant seeds of doubt while maintaining plausible deniability. Patricia would naturally want to protect the foundation from any potential scandal, and her questions about Robert's financial stability would seem like standard due diligence rather than the result of my investigation. Next, I called Jennifer Hartwell, despite the late hour. Asset protection specialists were accustomed to emergency calls from clients whose situations had suddenly become critical. Elena, Jennifer answered on the second ring. What's happening? The situation has escalated. I need you to expedite the remaining protective structures immediately. And I need you to prepare documentation that would allow me to acquire assets quickly if opportunities arise. What kind of assets? Business assets. Potentially distressed sales from companies facing sudden liquidity crises. I paused carefully. Hypothetically, if a business were to face sudden exposure of financial fraud, what would happen to its value? Jennifer's tone sharpened with professional interest. Depends on the extent of the fraud and the quality of the underlying assets. In most cases, legitimate buyers can acquire valuable businesses at significant discounts during crisis sales. How quickly could such acquisitions be structured? With proper preparation? Days rather than weeks. Elena, are you planning to acquire your husband's business? I'm planning to be ready for any eventuality. Robert's company has valuable assets and excellent client relationships. If circumstances arise that require rapid intervention, I want to be positioned to preserve what's worth preserving. Understood. I'll have everything ready by tomorrow afternoon. The pieces were falling into place with surgical precision. Michael's evidence would expose Marcus and Caroline's scheme. Patricia's questions would alert Robert to potential problems without seeming suspicious. And my financial preparations would position me to step in as the White Knight when Robert's world collapsed, but timing would be everything. I needed Robert to discover the truth when he was most vulnerable to accepting my guidance, when his faith in Marcus was already shaken by external circumstances. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Coffee with Uncle Robert tomorrow at 10 a.m. Discussing timeline for transition. Perfect. While Marcus was cementing what he thought was his final victory, I would be across town receiving Michael's complete evidence package. By the time Marcus finished his coffee, I would have everything needed to destroy him. I spent the remaining hours before dawn reviewing every detail of my plan. The evidence was comprehensive, the financial protections were in place, and the external pressure points were established. All that remained was choosing the perfect moment to spring the trap. At 7 a.m., Robert's alarm woke him for his morning routine. I pretended to be asleep, listening as he moved through his preparations with the satisfied efficiency of a man who believed he controlled his destiny. His shower, his careful grooming, his selection of the lucky tie he wore to important meetings, all of it performed with the confidence of someone who had no idea his world was about to implode. Good morning, darling, I said as he finished dressing. Big day ahead? Just coffee with Marcus, then some routine meetings. Robert adjusted his tie in the mirror, completely unaware that this would be the last day he looked at his nephew with unqualified trust. Nothing too dramatic. Have a wonderful time, I replied warmly. Give Marcus my love. Robert's breathing was audible over the phone. Can you send me a copy of that report? Of course, darling. I'll email it right now. Though I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation. I sent Michael's preliminary report while Robert was still on the line, listening to his sharp intake of breath as he read the executive summary. Elena, this shows over $2 million in unauthorized transfers. This isn't accounting errors, this is theft. Theft? I allowed genuine shock to enter my voice. Robert, who has access to those accounts? Only Marcus and myself. And the accounting department, but they don't have transfer authority. His voice trailed off as the implications hit him. This was the moment I'd been orchestrating for weeks. Robert's faith in Marcus was finally cracking, replaced by the terrible possibility that his beloved nephew might be betraying him. The psychological impact would be devastating, leaving him vulnerable to guidance from the one person who'd tried to protect him. Robert, I'm so sorry. I never imagined it could be anything this serious. I need to review everything immediately. Can you come to the office? I may need your help understanding some of these financial patterns. Of course. I'll be there in 20 minutes. As I drove to Robert's office, I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with critical moments in surgery. Everything had been planned and prepared, but execution still required perfect precision and timing. One wrong move could transform victory into disaster. I found Robert in his office, surrounded by printouts and computer screens, his face pale with shock and growing rage. The confident businessman who dismissed his wife's contributions just weeks ago had been replaced by a man facing the destruction of everything he'd trusted. "Elena, look at this," he said without preamble, pointing to a screen showing transaction histories. "Marcus has been transferring money to shell companies for over a year. Small amounts, carefully spaced, but it adds up to millions." I moved to stand beside him, my presence offering comfort while my mind noted every detail of his emotional state. Robert was moving through the classic stages of betrayal: denial, anger, bargaining, and eventually acceptance. My job was to guide him through the process while positioning myself as his ally rather than another threat. "Could there be some legitimate business reason?" I asked gently. "That's what I thought at first. But look at the timing, every transfer happens within hours of major client payments. And these shell companies?" Robert pulled up another screen. "They're registered to addresses that don't exist." I studied the evidence with apparent confusion, though I'd already reviewed every detail with Michael Torres. "Robert, this looks very sophisticated. This isn't casual theft, this is systematic fraud." "Exactly." Robert's voice carried a mixture of rage and heartbreak. "Marcus has been planning this for months, maybe years. And I trusted him completely." This was my opening. Robert's faith in his own judgment was shattered, making him receptive to guidance from someone who'd apparently tried to protect him by commissioning the financial review. "What do you want to do?" I asked softly. "I want to confront him immediately. I want to know how he could do this to family." "Robert, wait," I placed my hand on his arm. "If Marcus is involved in systematic fraud, confronting him directly might cause him to destroy evidence or disappear. Shouldn't we gather more information first?" Robert looked at me with something approaching respect for the first time in months. "You're right. You're absolutely right. If he's been this calculating, we need to be equally strategic. What if we brought in professionals? Forensic accountants who specialize in this kind of investigation? People who could build a case that would stand up in court." "Yes," Robert nodded decisively. "Elena, can your accountant recommend specialists?" "I'm sure he can." "And Robert, given the Foundation's concerns, should we also notify law enforcement? If this is criminal fraud, there may be legal requirements to report it." The suggestion of law enforcement sent another shock through Robert's system. Until this moment, he'd been thinking about family betrayal and business problems. The possibility of criminal charges made the situation feel suddenly real and serious. "You think it's that serious?" "Robert, millions of dollars in unauthorized transfers to fake companies? That's not a family dispute, that's a felony." As we discussed next steps, my phone buzzed with an update from Sullivan's team. Subjects discussing timeline acceleration. Female subject using phrases like final extraction and exit strategy. Male subject expressing concern about recent scrutiny. Perfect. Marcus and Caroline were panicking, probably sensing that something had changed in Robert's behavior. Their acceleration would force them to make mistakes, while their exit strategy discussions would provide additional evidence of premeditation. "Robert," I said carefully, "there's something else we should consider. If Marcus has been stealing for this long, he might not be working alone. These kinds of operations often involve multiple people." "What do you mean?" "Professional fraud rings. People who specialize in targeting wealthy families through trusted family members." I paused, letting him absorb the implication. "Has Marcus been dating anyone seriously? Someone who might have encouraged his interest in the family business?" Robert's face went white as he made the connection. "Caroline. He's been with a woman named Caroline for about 2 years. She's very interested in business, always asking questions about the company." "What kind of questions?" "Client lists, revenue streams, asset valuations." I thought she was just being supportive of Marcus's career development. Robert's voice cracked with the realization of how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. I reached for my phone. Robert, I think we need professional help immediately. This isn't just about Marcus anymore, this sounds like an organized criminal operation. As I dialed Michael Torres's number, I watched Robert struggle with the complete collapse of his worldview. The nephew he'd trusted was a thief. The girlfriend who'd seemed supportive was probably a professional con artist. The business he'd built was being systematically looted by people he'd welcomed into his family, but most importantly, the wife he'd planned to dismiss with $50,000 was the only person who'd tried to protect him. Michael, I said. As the call connected, we need to move to the comprehensive investigation immediately. Yes, Mr. Whitmore is fully aware and requesting immediate action. Yes, law enforcement should be involved. Tomorrow morning? Perfect. As I ended the call, Robert looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years, genuine gratitude mixed with dawning recognition of what he'd almost lost. Elena, he said quietly, if you hadn't commissioned that financial review, we would have discovered it eventually, I replied gently. The important thing now is protecting what we can and making sure they can't hurt anyone else. Robert nodded, but I could see him beginning to understand the broader implications. If I hadn't acted when I did, he would have signed over everything to Marcus through his revised will. Within months, his life's work would have been liquidated and disappeared, leaving him with nothing but the knowledge of how completely he'd been deceived. What about the will? He asked suddenly. The changes I made, if Marcus is a criminal, will need to address that too, I agreed. But one step at a time. Let's focus on stopping the immediate theft first. As evening fell over the city, Robert and I worked side by side in his office, documenting evidence and preparing for tomorrow's expanded investigation. The dynamic between us had fundamentally shifted. He was no longer the dismissive husband planning to exile his wife, but a vulnerable man grateful for the partner who'd saved him from destruction. The trap had been sprung perfectly. Marcus and Caroline were about to face the full weight of law enforcement, armed with months of documented evidence. Robert's faith in his nephew was destroyed, replaced by appreciation for the wife he'd nearly discarded, but most importantly, I was no longer the victim of Robert's betrayal. I was his rescuer, the strategist who'd outmaneuvered professional criminals while he'd been played for a fool. Tomorrow would bring arrests, revelations, and the complete unraveling of Marcus's schemes. But tonight, I savored the moment when everything changed, when the overlooked wife became the hero of her own story. The surgery was nearly complete, and the patient was going to survive. Detective Sarah Martinez arrived at 8:30 a.m. sharp, her presence transforming Robert's office from a family business into a crime scene. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent 15 years investigating white-collar fraud, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the financial evidence spread across Robert's desk. Mr. Whitmore, Detective Martinez said as she settled into the conference chair, I've reviewed the preliminary documentation your wife provided. This appears to be a sophisticated operation. How long has your nephew had access to these accounts? Robert's voice was hoarse from a sleepless night spent reviewing 2 years of financial records. 18 months of full access, but he's been involved in the business for over 2 years. I thought I was mentoring him for succession. And the girlfriend, Caroline Winters. How well do you know her? I thought I knew her well. She's been to family dinners, company events, holiday celebrations. Robert's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. She seemed genuinely interested in Marcus's career development, always asking thoughtful questions about the business. Detective Martinez made notes on her tablet, her expression professional but sympathetic. Those thoughtful questions were probably intelligence gathering. We're familiar with Ms. Winters, she's suspected in at least 3 similar cases across 2 states. I watched Robert absorb this information, seeing the final pieces of his delusion crumble. The woman he'd welcomed into family celebrations was a career criminal who'd studied him like a mark, gathering information to facilitate his destruction. What happens now? I asked, my voice carrying the concern of a wife trying to protect her family's interests. We're going to set up a controlled confrontation, Detective Martinez explained. Mr. Whitmore will arrange a meeting with his nephew, supposedly to discuss normal business matters. We'll record everything, giving Marcus an opportunity to explain the financial irregularities before making arrests. Robert looked up sharply. You want me to pretend nothing's wrong? Exactly. If Marcus thinks he's been discovered, he might flee or destroy evidence. But if he believes he's still in control, he'll likely try to deflect suspicion or even double down on his deception. What about Caroline? I asked. We have her under surveillance. The moment Marcus contacts her after your meeting, we'll have additional evidence of conspiracy. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Marcus would hang himself with his own lies while being recorded by law enforcement, creating an ironclad case for prosecution. But I knew there was more to accomplish than just criminal justice. Detective Martinez, I said carefully, given the scope of this fraud, what are the chances of recovering the stolen funds? Depends on how much they've already spent or moved offshore. We'll freeze all associated accounts immediately, but experience suggests recovery of maybe 60 to 70% in cases like this. I nodded, filing away this information for the next phase of my plan. If Robert could only recover 2/3 of his stolen money, he would face serious cash flow problems that might threaten his ability to maintain his business operations. That created opportunities for someone with liquid capital and a willingness to invest quickly. One more thing, Detective Martinez added. Mr. Whitmore, you mentioned that you recently revised your will to benefit your nephew. Given these circumstances, you might want to consider additional legal protections. Robert's face went ashen. The will. Elena, if we hadn't discovered this. He couldn't finish the sentence, but we all understood. Marcus would have inherited everything within months, then liquidated it all with Caroline before disappearing forever. We'll address the estate planning issues after we deal with the criminal matter, I said gently. One crisis at a time. At 10:15 a.m., Robert called Marcus from his office phone while Detective Martinez monitored from the adjacent conference room. I sat beside Robert, ostensibly for moral support but actually to ensure the conversation proceeded according to my strategic objectives. Marcus, Robert's voice was carefully controlled, can you come in this morning? I want to discuss the Patterson merger timeline. Of course, Uncle Robert. Is everything all right? You sound tense. Just tired. Too many late nights reviewing contracts. Can you be here by 11? Absolutely. Should I bring Caroline? She's been very interested in the merger strategy. Robert's knuckles went white as he gripped the phone. No, let's keep this between family for now. We can include her in future discussions. Perfect. See you at 11. As Robert hung up, Detective Martinez nodded approvingly. Excellent. He suspects nothing, and his offer to bring Caroline shows they're working as a team. The next 45 minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Robert paced his office like a caged animal, alternating between rage and heartbreak as he contemplated confronting the nephew he'd loved like a son. I used the time to review my own preparations, ensuring everything was in place for the post-arrest phase of my strategy. At exactly 11 a.m., Marcus's familiar knock echoed through Robert's office. I positioned myself in the corner where I could observe the confrontation without interfering, my medical training helping me maintain clinical detachment while watching a family destroy itself. Marcus entered with his usual confident stride. His expensive suit and perfect smile projecting the image of a successful young executive ready to inherit an empire. He had no idea he was walking into the most important performance of his life, one that would determine whether he spent the next decade in prison. Uncle Robert, Marcus said warmly, moving to embrace Robert in their traditional greeting. You look exhausted. Maybe you should take a vacation after we finalize the Patterson deal. I've been reviewing our financial statements, Robert replied, his voice carefully neutral. Some of the numbers don't look right. I watched Marcus's micro-expressions, noting the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated increased alertness. He was good, better than I'd expected, but 2 years of medical training in reading patient stress responses had prepared me to catch even subtle tells. What kind of numbers? Marcus asked, settling into his usual chair with apparent ease. Robert opened a folder containing the financial evidence, his movements deliberate and controlled. There are some transfers I don't remember authorizing. Money moving to companies I don't recognize. Marcus leaned forward to examine the documents, his performance flawless as he projected concerned confusion. That's strange. These account numbers look familiar, but I can't place them. Maybe we should check with accounting? I already did. They don't have records of these authorizations. Robert's voice was gaining strength as he continued the deception. Marcus, these transfers total over $2 million. This was the critical moment. Marcus could confess, deflect, or double down on his lies. His choice would determine not just his legal fate, but how completely his reputation would be destroyed. 2 million? Marcus's shock appeared genuine, his acting skills impressive even under extreme pressure. Uncle Robert, this looks like some kind of financial crime. We should contact law enforcement immediately. The audacity was breathtaking. Faced with evidence of his own theft, Marcus was suggesting they call the police. Either he was a sociopath, incapable of normal emotional responses, or he genuinely believed his performance was convincing enough to deflect suspicion. That's an interesting suggestion, Robert said slowly. But before we involve outsiders, I wanted to give you a chance to explain. You're the only other person with access to these accounts. Are you asking if I stole from you? Marcus's voice carried just the right note of hurt indignation. Uncle Robert, I'm your family. Everything I've done has been to help build our legacy. Our legacy. The possessive pronoun that Marcus used so naturally, claiming ownership of something he'd been systematically destroying. I found myself almost impressed by his commitment to the performance. Marcus, Robert continued, his voice growing firmer, these shell companies are registered to fake addresses. The transfers happen within hours of major client payments. This isn't random, it's systematic. For the first time, Marcus's composure cracked slightly. A brief flicker of panic crossed his features before he regained control, but I caught it. More importantly, the recording equipment caught it. I don't understand what you're implying, Marcus said carefully. If there's been financial fraud, we need to find the real perpetrator. Maybe someone in accounting, or an outside hacker. What? About Caroline? Robert asked suddenly. She's asked a lot of detailed questions about our operations. The mention of Caroline triggered another micro-expression, this time something that looked like genuine fear. Marcus was finally beginning to understand that his perfect plan was unraveling. Caroline doesn't have access to anything, Marcus replied, but his voice lacked the conviction of his earlier denials. She's just interested in my career. Is she? Robert pulled out another document, a photograph from Sullivan's surveillance, showing Marcus and Caroline together at the Seasons Hotel. Because according to this, she's been meeting with you regularly to discuss what she calls final extraction and exit strategies. The color drained from Marcus's face as he realized the scope of what Robert knew. His carefully constructed web of lies was collapsing, and there was no escape route that didn't involve confession or an even more elaborate deception. Uncle Robert, Marcus said, his voice taking on a pleading tone, I can explain everything. Yes, Caroline and I have discussed your business, but not for the reasons you think. Then explain. Marcus took a deep breath, apparently deciding to gamble everything on one final performance. We've been planning to surprise you. Caroline has connections with international investors who are interested in expanding Whitmore Industries globally. The money transfers you found? They're advance payments for preliminary partnership agreements. The lie was so audacious, so completely unsupported by evidence, that I had to admire its ambition. Marcus was betting that Robert's love for him would overcome logic and evidence. Show me these partnership agreements, Robert said quietly. They're still being drafted. Caroline's lawyers are handling the documentation. And the shell companies registered to fake addresses? Temporary holding entities for international transactions. Caroline explained that it's standard practice in overseas partnerships. Each lie dug Marcus deeper into a hole he couldn't escape. Detective Martinez was undoubtedly cataloging every false statement for the prosecution's case, while I watched the final destruction of Robert's faith in his nephew. Marcus, Robert said with infinite sadness, do you really expect me to believe that you've been stealing millions of dollars to surprise me with business partnerships? I haven't been stealing anything. Marcus's composure finally shattered completely. Every transaction was legitimate. If you can't trust family, who can you trust? The irony of that statement, coming from someone who'd spent 2 years systematically betraying family trust, would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. Marcus had just provided the perfect soundbite for his own prosecution. You're right, Robert said quietly. Family should be trustworthy. That's why this hurts so much. I saw the exact moment when Marcus realized his performance had failed. His shoulders slumped slightly, his confident expression replaced by the look of someone who'd just understood the magnitude of his mistake. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Robert could answer, Detective Martinez entered the office, her badge clearly visible and her presence instantly transforming the family confrontation into a criminal investigation. "Marcus Whitmore," she said formally, "you're under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." As Detective Martinez read Marcus's rights, I watched Robert struggle with emotions too complex for simple categorization. Relief that the truth was finally exposed, rage at the betrayal, grief for the relationship he'd lost, and underneath it all, a growing recognition of how completely he'd misjudged everyone in his life. Marcus was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit and confident demeanor reduced to the shabby desperation of a common criminal. His last words before leaving the office were directed at Robert: "You'll regret this. When you discover what you've really lost, you'll regret everything." The threat was hollow. Marcus was facing years in prison and had no remaining leverage, but it revealed the depth of his narcissistic rage. Even in defeat, he couldn't accept responsibility for his actions. As the office emptied of law enforcement personnel, Robert and I were left alone with the wreckage of his family relationships and business operations. The nephew he'd planned to inherit everything was now facing federal charges. The succession plan he'd spent months developing was worthless. And the wife he'd planned to dismiss with $50,000 was the only person who'd tried to protect him. "Elena," Robert said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion and regret, "I need to ask you something." "Of course." "When you commissioned that financial review, did you suspect Marcus?" It was the question I'd been waiting for, the moment when I could choose between complete honesty and strategic positioning. Robert needed to understand my role in exposing Marcus, but he also needed to see me as his protector rather than someone who'd been investigating him. "I suspected something was wrong," I replied carefully. "You'd been so stressed lately, and Marcus seemed to be influencing a lot of your decisions. I thought a financial review might give us clarity about our actual position before making major estate planning changes." It was true, as far as it went. I had suspected something was wrong, just not the something Robert was thinking about. "You saved everything," Robert said quietly. "If you hadn't acted when you did, we saved everything," I corrected gently. "We're a team, Robert. We always have been." As we began the long process of assessing the damage and planning recovery, I reflected on how completely the situation had transformed. 24 hours ago, I was the dismissed wife facing exile, with minimal resources. Now I was the hero of Robert's story, the strategist who'd outmaneuvered professional criminals while he'd been deceived by family, but most importantly, I was positioned perfectly for the final phase of my plan. Marcus was destroyed, Caroline would soon be arrested, and Robert's faith in his own judgment was shattered. When he revised his will again, and he would, very soon, he would be looking for guidance from the one person who'd proven worthy of his trust. The operation was nearly complete, and the patient was going to make a full recovery. But the scars would remain, serving as permanent reminders of what happened when trust was misplaced and loyalty was undervalued. After all, the best surgeries didn't just remove diseased tissue, they ensured it could never grow back. 3 months after Marcus's arrest, Robert sat across from me in David Fletcher's law office, the same office where I'd first sought advice about challenging his original will. The irony wasn't lost on me. We were here to create a new estate plan that would reflect the reality Robert had finally been forced to acknowledge. "The asset recovery process has yielded better results than expected," Fletcher reported, reviewing the thick file on his desk. "We've recovered approximately $2.8 million of the $3.2 million that was stolen, and the government has seized Caroline's assets from her previous frauds. Those proceeds will be distributed among her victims, including Mr. Whitmore." Robert nodded, though his satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge of how close he'd come to losing everything. The federal prosecution had been swift and merciless. Marcus received 8 years in federal prison, while Caroline got 12 years for her role as the mastermind of multiple fraud schemes. Their appeals had been rejected, and they were now serving their sentences in separate facilities hundreds of miles apart. "What's our current financial position?" Robert asked. "Stronger than before the theft, actually," Fletcher replied with a slight smile. The asset seizures netted an additional $1.4 million beyond what was stolen from you, and Dr. Reyes Whitmore's strategic investments during the crisis have yielded exceptional returns. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. During the chaos following Marcus's arrest, while Robert was dealing with law enforcement and business disruption, I had quietly moved to acquire distressed assets from other families caught up in Caroline's schemes. My independent wealth, combined with my ability to move quickly while others hesitated, had resulted in a portfolio worth more than Robert's original business. Elena's investments? Robert looked at me with surprise. I didn't realize you'd been that active in the markets. When the government seized Caroline's assets, several excellent opportunities became available, I explained modestly. Real estate, business interests, investment portfolios, all selling at significant discounts because of the criminal association. I thought it would be prudent to diversify our holdings. What I didn't mention was that I now controlled assets worth approximately $15 million, all completely separate from Robert's business interests. The wife he'd planned to dismiss with $50,000 had quietly assembled a fortune that dwarfed his own. That was very far-sighted of you, Robert said, and I caught the note of respect in his voice that had been absent for years. Fletcher cleared his throat diplomatically. Which brings us to the purpose of today's meeting. Mr. Whitmore, you've indicated that you want to completely restructure your estate plan in light of recent events. Yes, Robert said firmly. The previous will is obviously no longer viable. And I want to ensure that Elena is properly provided for. He paused, the weight of his earlier dismissal of me hanging in the air. She's proven to be the only person I can truly trust. I maintained an expression of loving support while internally savoring the complete reversal of our positions. 6 months ago, Robert had casually informed me that I would receive $50,000 and some jewelry because I wasn't really a Whitmore. Now he was acknowledging that I was the only person worthy of his trust. What specific provisions do you have in mind? Fletcher asked. I want Elena to inherit everything, Robert said without hesitation. The business, the real estate, all financial assets. She's earned it through her loyalty and wisdom. Fletcher made notes, though I caught his brief glance in my direction. He was undoubtedly thinking about our previous meeting, when I'd sought advice about challenging Robert's dismissive will. Now Robert was volunteering to give me everything I could have fought for legally. There are some tax implications to consider, Fletcher continued, but we can structure the inheritance to minimize those issues. Dr. Reyes Whitmore, do you have any concerns about inheriting business operations you're not directly involved in? This was my cue to demonstrate the strategic thinking that had saved Robert's empire. Actually, I've been giving that considerable thought. Robert has built an excellent business, but recent events have shown the importance of diversification and professional management. I pulled out a folder containing the business plan I'd been developing. I propose that we restructure Whitmore Industries as part of a larger holding company that includes my healthcare investments, the real estate portfolio I've acquired, and several strategic partnerships I've been developing. Robert's eyes widened as he reviewed my proposals. The scope of my strategic thinking clearly surprised him, revealing capabilities he'd never suspected I possessed. Elena, this is incredibly sophisticated. You've thought through market positioning, operational synergies, risk management. This is the work of someone with serious business expertise. I've had 12 years to observe and learn, I replied calmly. And recent events have shown me the importance of being prepared for contingencies. What I didn't say was that I'd been developing this plan since the day I discovered his original will. Every strategic acquisition, every business relationship, every financial maneuver had been designed to position me not just to survive his betrayal, but to emerge stronger and more successful than he'd ever been. Fletcher reviewed my proposals with growing admiration. Dr. Reyes Whitmore, this would create one of the most diversified and stable family investment entities in the region. The risk management alone would prevent the kind of vulnerability that allowed the recent fraud. Exactly, I agreed. We need governance structures that prevent any single person from having the kind of access that Marcus exploited. Checks and balances, professional oversight, transparent reporting. As we spent the next 2 hours developing the legal framework for our new estate plan, I watched Robert's understanding of my capabilities evolve in real time. The passive wife he dismissed was revealing herself to be a strategic thinker whose Business acumen matched or exceeded his own. There's one more element I'd like to discuss, I said as our meeting drew to a close. The Children's Hospital Foundation has approached me about joining their board of directors. Given our enhanced charitable giving capacity, I think it would be valuable for our family to take a leadership role in community philanthropy. Patricia Hendricks had indeed approached me, though not coincidentally. My role in exposing Marcus's fraud had impressed the foundation's leadership, and my newly revealed financial resources made me an attractive board candidate. More importantly, board service would provide social visibility and community standing that would cement my transformation from dismissed wife to respected business leader. That's an excellent idea, Robert agreed immediately. Patricia Hendricks mentioned how impressed they were with your handling of the whole situation. They particularly appreciated our transparency about the financial irregularities, I noted. It demonstrated the kind of integrity they value in major donors. As we left Fletcher's office, Robert was quiet and thoughtful. The new will would be executed within the week, giving me complete control of everything he'd once planned to deny me. But more than that, our entire relationship had been fundamentally altered by recent events. Elena, Robert said as we reached our car, I owe you an enormous apology. For what? For not seeing who you really are. For underestimating your intelligence, your strategic thinking, your loyalty. He paused, struggling with emotions he'd rarely expressed. I nearly destroyed everything because I was too arrogant to recognize the value of what I already had. It was the closest thing to a complete acknowledgement of his betrayal that I was likely to receive. Robert wasn't the type of man who dwelt on past mistakes, preferring to focus on future opportunities. But his recognition of how thoroughly he'd misjudged me was sufficient for my purposes. We're stronger now than we were before, I replied, allowing warmth to enter my voice. Sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal what really matters. That evening, we hosted our first dinner party since Marcus's arrest. The guest list had been carefully curated to include key figures from Robert's business network, the medical community, and civic organizations. It was an opportunity to debut our new partnership publicly, showing the world that the Whitmore family had not only survived their crisis but emerged more powerful than before. Dr. Patricia Hendricks raised her glass during the toast. To Robert and Elena Whitmore, whose grace under pressure and commitment to transparency set an example for our entire community. The assembled guests murmured their agreement, toasting a couple they saw as having weathered a family crisis with dignity and wisdom. None of them suspected that the wife they were celebrating had orchestrated the entire sequence of events that led to this moment. As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversation with Douglas Chen from the Foundation's Financial Committee. Elena, I have to ask, how did you know to commission that financial review when you did? The timing was incredibly fortunate. Intuition, really, I replied modestly. Something felt off about the business dynamics, and I thought it would be wise to understand our actual financial position before making any major decisions. Your instincts probably saved your husband's entire company. Marcus could have done far more damage if he'd had additional time. If he only knew that Marcus had been planning to liquidate everything within months of inheriting it. But that knowledge would remain my secret, along with the true scope of the strategic planning that had brought us to this point. Later that night, as Robert and I prepared for bed, he reflected on how dramatically our circumstances had changed. 6 months ago, I thought I had everything figured out, he said, removing the tie I'd given him for his birthday. I had a succession plan, a clear vision for the future, complete confidence in my judgment. And now I realize that wisdom often comes from recognizing how much you don't know. He turned to face me directly. Elena, I want you to know that going forward, every major decision will be made together. No more unilateral planning, no more assumptions about what's best for our family. It was exactly what I'd needed to hear. Robert had learned the lesson I'd spent months teaching him, that dismissing me was the most expensive mistake he could make. I'm grateful for your trust, I replied. And I want you to know that everything I've done has been to protect and strengthen what we've built together. It was true, in its way. Everything I'd done had been to protect what we'd built. I'd just been more selective about which parts were worth preserving and which needed to be surgically removed. As I lay in bed that night, I reflected on the complete transformation of our circumstances. The husband who'd planned to exile me was now dependent on my strategic guidance. The nephew who'd plotted to steal everything was serving 8 years in federal prison. The business that had nearly been destroyed was now part of a larger empire. Under my control, but most satisfying of all was the knowledge that I'd achieved this transformation without ever revealing my true role in orchestrating events. In Robert's mind, I was the loyal wife who'd saved him through intuition and dedication. He would never know about the months of surveillance, the careful manipulation of external pressure points, or the strategic timing that had brought Marcus's schemes to light at exactly the right moment, the original will that had started this entire sequence. The document that dismissed me with $50,000 and some jewelry, now sat in a secure storage facility along with all the other evidence of Robert's poor judgment. It served as a reminder of how completely circumstances could change when the overlooked player finally decided to take control of the game. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. The board position at the Children's Hospital Foundation would provide additional community influence. The diversified investment portfolio would continue generating wealth independent of Robert's business decisions. And the governance structures we'd implemented would ensure that no one could ever again accumulate the kind of unchecked power that Marcus had exploited. But tonight, I simply savored the sweet taste of complete victory. The dismissed wife had become the family strategist. The underestimated partner had proven herself indispensable. And the woman who'd been deemed unworthy of a real inheritance had quietly assembled a fortune that made such concerns irrelevant. After all, the most successful operations weren't just about removing diseased tissue, they were about ensuring the patient emerged healthier, stronger, and completely transformed. The surgery was complete, and the results exceeded every expectation I dared to hold. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.